file that started all of this was never meant to be read twice. It was opened once in the autumn of 1941 by a medical officer of the Red Army named Vasily Sergeyevich Karapetyan, and it was closed by him a few days later, and for 40 years it sat in a cabinet in a building that changed its name 3 times, while the paper inside it did not change at all. Karapetyan was a lieutenant colonel, 44 years old that winter, attached to the medical service and posted for roughly 12 weeks to the town of Buynaksk in the Dagestan Republic, in the foothills below the Eastern Caucasus. This was the second year of the war with Germany. The front was a long way off and getting closer every week, and the man in Karapetyan's position spent his days on typhus and frostbite and the ordinary arithmetic of keeping a garrison alive through a mountain winter. He was not a man who believed in things. The record is very clear on this point. Everyone who described him afterward described a dry, careful, unimaginative officer, which is exactly the kind of witness the report would later need him to be.
On a cold morning in December, a local police officer came up to the garrison and asked Karapetyan to come and look at a prisoner. The civil authorities had taken a man in the hills above the town, and they could not decide what he was. He would not answer questions. He would not give a name. They thought at first he was a deserter, and then they thought he was a German agent, left behind to signal for the aircraft, and they wanted a medical officer to tell them whether the man was fit to be interrogated properly, which in the winter of 1941 meant something specific and final. Karapetyan went and looked at the prisoner, and the report he wrote is the reason any of this exists. He described a man who is not a man, naked in an unheated cell in December and not shivering, covered from the shoulders down in a fine dark hair that grew thickest on the chest and the backs of the arms, a head that sat wrong on the neck, the brow heavy and shelved out over the eyes so that the whole face seemed to lean back from its own features. The skin of the face weathered to a gray-brown that Karapetyan compared, in the one flourish the report allowed him, to old leather left out through several seasons. The eyes flat and without much light in them. The man did not speak. The report was careful to say that it could not determine whether he would not speak or could not. He ate nothing that was offered. He watched the door. Karapetyan wrote that the prisoner was not a spy and was not, in any sense he could certify, insane. He declined to certify anything else. He was a medical officer and he had been asked a medical question and he answered only the question. What happened to the prisoner after that is recorded in a single line, added later in a different hand. The man in the cell was shot as a German agent, the sentence carried out on schedule, the body buried in the yard behind the civil authority building and not marked. That is the true part. That is the part that was written down in 1941 by a real officer in a real town, and it was filed, and it was sealed, and it should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it. In the spring of 1972, someone opened the file again, and where Karapetyan had seen a tragedy and closed the cabinet, the men who opened it 3 decades later saw something else. They saw a procedure. They read the report not as the account of one dead prisoner, but as a set of instructions. The state had done this once. The state had held one of these creatures in a room, had examined it, had confirmed with a physician's signature that it was real and was not human. And then, in the panic of the war, the state had thrown that confirmation away by shooting the only specimen it would ever have. The men who reopened the file in 1972 did not intend to make that mistake. This is the account of the 4 seasons that followed, assembled from the survey's own logs, from the field notebooks of men who were not supposed to keep field notebooks, and from one long conversation recorded much later with the only member of the expedition whose name appears on all 4 rosters. The survey had a cover designation and a real one. The cover was a geodetic mapping assignment in a glacial valley on the Tajik side of the Pamir range, in support of a hydroelectric project that was surveyed exhaustively and never built. The real designation is redacted in every copy of the document that has surfaced. The men on the ground called the valley by its map coordinate and called the assignment, among themselves, the second reading of Karapetyan. The officer in command of the survey was a major of engineers named Anatoly Devin, 51 years old, a geodesist by training and by temperament, the sort of man who trusted a thing only after he had measured it 3 times. His second was a captain named Ilya Rushin, 38, a younger and colder man who had come up through a directorate that the log does not name. Between them on the roster were 9 other men, surveyors and drivers, and 2 soldiers whose specialty is listed only as technical support. And there was a warrant officer named Grigory Paltim, 41 years old in the first season, a quartermaster and fixer, the man who signed for the equipment and the rations and later for other things. Palim is the name on all 4 rosters. Palim is the man who talked at the very end, and everything in the first person that closes this account is his. The first season ran from the thaw to the first snows of 1972, and on its surface it was exactly what the cover said it was. They mapped the valley, they set benchmarks, and they ran their lines, and they filled notebooks with elevations, and if you read only the geodetic record, you would think 11 men spent 5 months doing careful, boring, honest work in a beautiful and empty place. The other record begins in the 3rd week. A driver named Yefim found the first track in soft ground near the upper stream, and he found it because his dog would not go near it. The dog was a survey animal, steady, used to bears and to the smell of blood, and it sat down 40 meters from the stream bank and would not be moved and made a sound the men had not heard it make before. The track was in the mud where the stream had overrun its bank in the melt. It was a footprint, and it was the wrong shape and the wrong size. Devin measured it because Devin measured everything. He recorded the length and the width and the depth of the impression and the length of the stride to the next print. And then he did the arithmetic that his whole profession had trained him to do. And the arithmetic told him the weight of the thing that had made it. And he stopped writing in the middle of a sentence and did not finish it for 4 days. They cast the track in plaster. That cast is one of the objects the survey's final report both lists and does not include. The log says a plaster impression was taken, catalogued, and forwarded. Where it was forwarded to is redacted. What is not redacted is Devin's note in his own careful hand that the toe configuration did not match any species he could file it under, and that he had checked the reference material twice, and that the reference material he had checked was the 1941 report. There was a second cast before the season ended, and it is the one Devin did not forward. He took it himself, alone, on a morning in the 9th week from a print in wet snow on the far bank of the upper stream, and he recorded in the log only that a further impression had been observed and was not of casting quality. That was a lie, and it is the only lie in Devin's hand anywhere in 4 seasons of his logs, because the print was of casting quality, and he cast it, and he kept the cast in his own kit, and it went down the mountain with his personal effects and not into the survey record. Palemi knew about it because Palemi inventoried Devin's kit at the end of the first season and found the cast wrapped in a shirt at the bottom of it. And Devin took it back from him without a word, and Palem did not ask. What was on the second cast was the reason Devin hid it. The first print had been a track, a foot, wrong-toed, and too wide, but a foot. The kind of thing a man could file under an unknown animal and sleep at night. The second print was a handprint, pressed flat into the snow beside the stream as though the thing had knelt to drink. And it was not the hand of an animal. It had a thumb. It had the thumb set, opposed the way a man's thumb is set, and it was longer than Devon's own hand by a third. And the depth of it in the snow said the weight behind it was the same weight the footprints carried. And a thing that weighs what the footprints said and has a hand shaped like that is not a thing. A geodesist has any column to enter in a table. Devon cast it and hid it and lied in the log and asked before the second season to be relieved. The two facts sit next to each other in the record, and the record does not connect them, and Paliame telling it did connect them and then said he could not prove the connection and would not insist on it. The dog did not last the first season. Yefim's animal, the one that had sat down 40 meters from the first track and refused the stream bank, grew worse as the weeks went on and not better. It would not sleep at night. It stood in the camp with its face to the upper valley and made the sound it had made at the stream, low and continuous for hours, on nights when there was nothing any man could see or hear. And in the morning there would sometimes be tracks at the edge of the camp perimeter, and sometimes there would not. And the dog's behavior did not correlate with the tracks, which was the part that unsettled the men most. The nights the dog stood and faced the valley and would not stop were not the nights the tracks appeared. It was as though the dog knew about a thing that had not yet arrived. In the 11th week, it slipped its line in the dark and went up the valley toward whatever it faced, and it did not come back. And Yefim went a short way after it in the morning and found the line it had been tied with lying in the snow with the collar still buckled to it, still buckled. The buckle not broken and not undone, the collar simply empty, and he came back and did not go looking again. Because they had it with them. That is the thing to hold on to. They had Karapetyan's report in the field with them, the way another survey team would carry a manual for the theodolite. And when they found something they did not understand, they did not ask, "What is this?" They opened the report and asked, "Is this the one?" The document was the authority. The document told them what they were looking for, and told them, section by section, how the last men to hold one had held it. Section 4 of the 1941 report, the section Karapetyan had written most reluctantly, described the physical restraint of the prisoner, and so in the second month of the first season, on the strength of a 30-year-old medical document and a plaster cast of a footprint, Captain Rostyan ordered the construction of a snare. It was not a snare for an animal, it was engineered. Palim signed for the materials, industrial cable of a gauge used to winch vehicles, a spring mechanism built in the survey's own field shop, an anchor post sunk 2 meters into ground that was still frozen hard below the first spade's depth. Rostyan sighted it on the upper stream where the track had been, on the theory the report supported, that the creature followed water. They built it over 3 days. They baited it, the log does not say with what. And they set it, and they waited, and on the 4th morning they went up to the stream and found the snare sprung and empty, and the anchor post pulled clean out of the frozen ground and lying 6 meters away. Devon measured the hole the post had left. He measured the distance the post had traveled. He wrote the numbers down. And he did not do the arithmetic this time, or if he did not record the answer, because the answer was that no 2 men in the camp could have pulled that post, and there had been no machine within 40 kilometers, and the ground all around the sprung snare held only the one kind of track. The snare had not failed. The snare had been read. Something had come to the water and understood the cable and the spring and the buried post as a thing built to hold it, and had taken the trap apart from the inside and set the pieces down and walked away. Roshin's note on the incident is 2 words. Devin's note is longer and ends with a sentence he crossed out so heavily it cannot be recovered, which is the only time in 4 seasons of logs that either man is recorded as having written something and then decided that no one should ever read it. They finished the season, they mapped the valley, the snows came early and they went down, and the geodetic report was filed on time and was, by all accounts, excellent. And over the winter, in a building whose name is redacted, someone read the other report, the one with the plaster cast and the pulled post. And instead of closing the cabinet, they authorized a second season with an expanded objective. The first season had established that the creature was real and was intelligent. The second season was to bring one out. They went back in the autumn of the following year, which the log gives as 1973, when the valley was already turning and the high stream was already skinning over with the first ice. The roster had changed. Rostyan was still second. Devin was still in command, though Palim much later would say that Devin had come back a different man, quieter, slower to sign things, and that he had asked to be relieved before the season and been refused. There were new men, and there was new equipment, heavier, purpose-built, and there was a directive that the men were read aloud and did not sign, which told them that the objective of the season was the acquisition of a specimen and that the specimen was to be taken alive. The second season is when the radio started, and the radio is the incident the men agreed among themselves not to enter in the log, so it survives only in Palim's account, and in one line of Zelov's notebook that corroborates it. The survey carried a field set for contact with the base station down the valley, a heavy-powered unit that a man switched on and warmed up before it would do anything. And in the 3rd week of the second season, the operator, a soldier whose name Palime gave as Kostin, came to Devin and reported that the set was receiving while switched off. Not static, not a fault in a powered-down set, which cannot receive anything because it is not drawing power and its components are cold and dead. It was receiving a sound, low and rhythmic and patient, and it was receiving it through a set that was switched off and unplugged. And Kostin had heard it because he slept beside the set, and it woke him. Devin had the set torn down and inspected, and there was nothing wrong with it, and switched off and unplugged it did not receive in daylight with 3 men watching it. At night, with 1 man beside it, it received. The sound was described the same way by every man who heard it, a slow booming, spaced like a heavy call, at a distance carried on cold air, except that it did not come from the air. It came from the dead speaker of an unpowered radio, and it came only at night and only when a single man was near it, and never when the men gathered to hear it, so that no group of them ever confirmed it together, and each man who heard it alone and could not make the next man believe it. Zelov's note on the radio is 1 line, and it says the set spoke to him on the night of the 14th, and he did not answer it and did not sleep. Kostin asked to be relieved, and was, and went down the mountain in the 4th week. And after Kostin left, the set was never reported receiving again, which the men took to mean that the thing had been calling to a particular man and not to the machine, and had stopped when the man it wanted was gone. The section of the 1941 report they worked from now was the section on the prisoner's habits. Karapetyan had noted in his dry way that the man in the cell had watched the door and not the men, that he had oriented always toward the way out and not toward the things around him, and that I had shown no fear that Karapetyan could identify, only a kind of patience. Rostyan built the second season's plan on that patience. If the creature would not spring a trap, then the trap had to be one it could not read as a trap, and the only such trap, Rostyan reasoned, was open ground, where a thing that oriented toward the way out could be given a way out that led exactly where they wanted it. The way out he chose was the lake. There was a lake at the head of the valley, high and long, and the maps the first season had made said it froze solid, bed to surface, by the middle of autumn. Roshin's plan was to drive the creature onto the ice, out into the open where the trees could not shelter it, and to take it there in the flat, white nowhere with numbers and cable and the new equipment. The men were positioned. The drive began at dusk on a date the log gives precisely, and it is the last precise thing the log gives for 2 days, because what happened on the ice is recorded twice and the two records do not agree. A surveyor named Pyotr Zalov, 29 years old, went out on the lake during the drive. The official log says he went out to reset a marker that had shifted, that the ice gave way under him at a soft place the survey had failed to mark, and that he went through and could not be recovered before the cold took him, and that the season was suspended for the loss. Exposure. A marker, a soft place, an accident on the ice. The log is very clear and very calm, and it closes the incident in 4 lines. Zalov kept a notebook he was not supposed to. Palim found it in Zalov's kit when he inventoried the dead man's effects, which was Palim's job, and Palim did not forward it, which was not his job, and it is because of that single small dereliction that there is a second account of the ice. Zalov's notebook says he did not go out to reset a marker. It says the drive worked. It says they moved the creature exactly as Roshin had planned, out of the tree line and onto the open lake, and that for a moment, in the last of the light, they had it in the flat, white center of the ice with men on every shore, and that it stood there and did not run. It says the creature looked at the shore where Zalov was and then walked, without hurry, straight out toward him across ice that 11 men had just proven would hold a running creature that weighed what the plaster cast said it weighed. And Zalov, 29 years old and certain he was about to make the capture, went out to meet it. The last full entry in the notebook says the ice was solid the whole way out, and it was solid where he stood, and it was solid where the creature stood, 3 meters away, close enough that he wrote down the color of its eyes. And then the entry ends. There is one more line, added in a shakier hand, and no one can say how much later, and the one more line says, "It was standing on the water where I went through. It did not go through. It knew." The season was suspended. They carried what they could carry, and they went down early, and the official report recorded the loss of 1 surveyor to an ice accident and requested, over the winter, authorization for a 3rd season. And someone in the building whose name is redacted read both the 4-line official account and, one has to assume, the fact of the pulled snare from the year before, and weighed a dead man against a live specimen and authorized the 3rd season, and this time attached a physician. The 3rd season is the one the photographs come from. There are not many. The survey was not documented in the ordinary way, and most of what it produced was destroyed or sealed. But a handful of frames survive, and the men who have seen them describe the same image. Deep winter, the year the log gives as 1974. 2 officers in greatcoats hauling on chains in the blue dark before dawn, their boots dug into the snow, their whole weight thrown back against the pull. And at the other end of the chains, not pulling, not fighting, simply standing and letting itself be held, a creature over 7 feet tall and built like nothing that should be alive. They had done it. The 3rd season did the thing the 2nd season had died trying to do. And the report is almost silent on how, which is its own kind of evidence, because everything the men were proud of is recorded in detail. And the one thing they were not proud of is recorded not at all. There's a gap in the log of 11 days between the 3rd season's arrival in the valley and the first entry that describes the specimen in custody, and that gap is never filled. And Palame, at the very end, when he told the rest of it plainly, would not tell that. That was the one thing. He said only that they had used the report and that the report had a section they had not read closely enough the first 2 seasons, and that once they read it closely, the thing was done in a week. He would not say what the section said. What is recorded is the custody. He held it for 11 days. They held it in a converted equipment shelter, a low prefabricated hut with a stove they did not light, because the creature was warmer than the room and the physician wanted to observe that. The physician's name is redacted. His notes are not, or not entirely, and his notes are the coldest document in the whole archive because he was doing exactly what Karapetyan had done in 1941, examining a captive creature and recording only what he could certify, except that Karapetyan had done it in an afternoon. And this man did it for 11 days and never once in 11 days of notes used a word that admitted the creature was anything other than a specimen. The notes are dated by day of custody rather than by calendar, and they read in the surviving fragments, like the log of an instrument left running against something it was not built to measure. Day 1 records the specimen's dimensions, taken while it was still freshly chained, and the note says cooperative, which is the physician's word and is a strange word for a thing held on winch cable, and records the height at over 7 feet, and the reach and the span of the hands and the weight estimated because they had no scale that would take it. Day 2 records the refusal of food and water and records it as a clinical finding with no comment. Day 3 records that the specimen had not slept in the sense the physician could identify, had not closed its eyes for any observed period, and had spent the night as it spent the day, upright, still facing the door. Day 4 is where the notes begin to change, though the physician would never have admitted a change, because the language stays flat, and it is only the content that turns. Day 4 records that the specimen tracked the physician's movements about the hut, not with its eyes, but with its whole attention, that a man could feel himself watch with the light off and his back turned, and that this was noted as a subjective impression and therefore not admissible as data, and then noted anyway, which is the first crack in 11 days of discipline. Day 5 records the brow ridge and the flat reflective eyes, and the wide human set of the face in the same terms the 1941 report had used, and the physician must have had that report at his elbow. And day 5 is the day he stopped describing the face, because after day 5 the face is not mentioned again in any surviving note, and the men who have read the fragments think he stopped because he had looked at it too long. Day 6 records the notch. There is a torn notch in the specimen's left ear, an old healed split, and the physician recorded it on day 6 as an identifying feature and measured it. And it is the one detail in the notes that makes the creature a particular creature and not a type. One animal with one history that included whatever had torn its ear long before the survey ever built its first snare. Day 7 and day 8 are missing. Day 9 records that the specimen had begun, in the physician's phrase, to attend to the men individually, to look at each man who entered as though it were learning him, and records that 2 of the guard detail asked to be rotated off the shelter and were, and does not record why. Day 10 is a single line, and the line says the specimen is patient. Not the specimen appears patient, not the specimen exhibits patience, the specimen is patient. The only sentence in 11 days of notes where the physician states a thing about the creature's mind as a fact and not a measurement, and it is the last full entry before the 11th day. And after it, the notes become the 2 pages that do not agree. It would not eat. This is in the physician's notes, and it is in Pamirs' account, and they agree. They offered it everything they had, and it took none of it, and showed no sign of suffering for it. And the physician recorded the refusal as data and did not wonder at it. It did not pace. A captured animal paces. The physician had expected pacing, and its absence is noted with something that might be, if you read the clinical language generously, the beginning of unease. It did not test the chains. It had pulled an anchor post out of frozen ground with what the arithmetic said was contemptuous ease, and it sat in a chained room for 11 days and never once pulled against the chains, and the physician recorded that it could have left and did not, and recorded it flatly as a measurement, the way you would record a temperature. It watched the door. Karapetyan had written that in 1941, one sentence in a report about a prisoner in Buynaksk, and 33 years later, a physician whose name is blacked out wrote it again about a creature in a hut in the Pamirs in almost the same words, and the survey had that first report in the room with them, and someone must have noticed, and no one wrote down that they noticed. It watched the door, not the men, not the physician with his instruments, the door, the way out. It oriented toward the way out for 11 days, the way the man in Buynaksk had oriented toward it for the few days he was allowed to live. And it waited, with the patience Karapetyan had been the first to record and had not had a word for. And on the 11th day, the log stops agreeing with itself. There are 2 pages. The first page in the physician's hand records the death of the specimen. It gives a time. It gives a clinical cause that the redaction has eaten. It says the specimen expired in custody at the recorded hour, and that examination of the remains would proceed. It is a complete and ordinary page, and if it were the only page, there would be no mystery, only a captured creature that died in a cold hut and was cut up by a man who never admitted it was more than meat. The second page is the next day, and it is in a different hand, an administrative hand, and it requisitions transport. It requisitions a vehicle and a detail of men and the materials to move a body of a specified and considerable weight down out of the valley before the pass is closed. It is dated 1 day after the page that records the death. And it is a completely ordinary page too, the exact page you would expect the survey to generate the day after a specimen died, a body to be moved, a requisition to move it. The 2 pages cannot both be true, or rather they can both be true only in a way that no one in the survey ever wrote down. Because there is a third document, a single line, added to the file at some later point in yet another hand, and the single line says that the transport detail went up to the shelter on the day the requisition specifies and found the chains lying open on the floor of the hut, and no body and no specimen, and the stove cold and the door, which had been barred from the outside every night for 11 days, standing open. The report does not reconcile them. This is the thing to understand about the 3rd season, and it is the thing the whole survey turns on. The physician's page says it died. The transport requisition assumes a body to move. The transport detail found the room empty and the door open. And the final report, the sealed one, includes all 3 and adjudicates none of them, and closes the 3rd season with a single sentence that says the specimen was no longer in custody as of the 11th day, and leaves it there. And the survey never wrote down and possibly never decided whether the creature they held for 11 days died in that room or walked out of it. Pamirs would not tell that part. He told everything else at the end plainly and without much emotion, an old man in a small apartment with a recorder running. But when the account reached the 11th day, he stopped, and the recording has a long silence in it. And then he said only that they had gone up to the shelter and the chains were open and the room was empty, and that he had signed for the chains when they came back down, empty, and had cataloged them because that was his job, and that the number the chains were cataloged under was the last number he ever assigned in that valley. There was a 4th season and it did not happen. It was authorized. The roster exists. Devon was not on it. He had by then been relieved or had relieved himself. The log is unclear and Pamir was not gentle about it. He said only that Devon went home after the 3rd season and did not come to the 4th and did not answer letters. Rostchin was on the 4th roster and Pamir was on it, because Pamir was always on it and 7 other men. And the 4th season was to return to the valley in the spring of 1975 and resume the objective, which was still, on paper, the acquisition of a specimen, as though the 3rd season had acquired nothing, as though the 11 days had not happened, as though a document could unhappen a thing by declining to decide whether it had happened at all. The men would not go. This is the flattest and most bureaucratic horror in the whole account, and it is the one Pamir told most readily because it was the one with no creature in it, only paper. The men who had been in the valley in the 3rd season would not sign for the 4th. They did not mutiny. There was nothing to mutiny against. They simply, one after another, produced reasons, medical reasons and family reasons and reasons of specialty. And the reasons were accepted because to refuse them would have required someone to write down what the men were refusing, and no one would write that down. The survey could not compel the 4th season because compelling it meant naming the 3rd season, and the 3rd season was sealed. And so the objective that could not be unauthorized also could not be carried out. And it sat in that condition, authorized and impossible, until the paper simply aged out of relevance. The hydroelectric project was quietly canceled. The engineering report that had recommended the site, the excellent geodetic work of 4 seasons, was filed and never acted on, because the site was in a valley that a small number of men would not return to and would not fully explain. And it was easier to cancel a dam than to ask why. The valley went back to being a coordinate on a map. The survey was stood down, the men dispersed. Devon died a few years later of ordinary causes. Rostchin, the log, loses entirely. There is a transfer notation and then nothing. And Pamir, asked directly, said he did not know what became of Rostchin and said it in a way that closed the subject. And the file went up, everything the survey had made, the geodetic work and the plaster cast and the physician's 11 days of notes and the 2 pages that did not agree and the single line about the open door, all of it was assembled into a final report. And the final report was sealed, and it went up the chain the way such things go up, from a building whose name is redacted to a building above it whose name is also redacted, and it did not come back down. Pamir signed the manifest that sent it up. His signature is the last thing in the working file before the working file ends. He signed for the survey the way he had signed for the chains because it was his job, and then there was nothing left in the valley to sign for, and he went home. He was an old man when he talked, and he did not talk to make anyone believe him. He said that at the start. He said he was not trying to prove anything and did not care whether he was believed, that he was too old to care and had signed too many things to start lying about them now. He talked because he was the only one left who had been on all 4 rosters, and because the file was sealed and would stay sealed. And a sealed file, he said, is not the same as a thing that did not happen. A sealed file is a thing that happened and was decided about. Someone read all of it, the 11 days and the open door and the section of the 1941 report they had not read closely enough. And someone decided, and the decision was to seal it. And sealing a thing is not the same as saying it isn't real. It is the opposite. You do not seal what isn't real. You seal what is real and cannot be allowed. He talked about Karapetyan at the end, though he never met him, and Karapetyan was long dead. He said he thought about him. He said he thought that the doctor in Buynaksk in 1941 had done a smaller and cleaner version of the thing they had done in the valley, and had had the good luck to do it in wartime, when a creature in a cell could be called a spy and shot and buried in a yard, and that was the end of it, because in wartime the paper did not have to reconcile anything. and that the men in 1972 had opened that clean small file and had not understood that it was clean and small only because it had been allowed to stay that way, and had reopened it and had made it large, and had learned in 11 days in a cold hut why the doctor in Buynaksk had signed only what he could certify and gone no further. Pamirs signed only what he could certify too at the end. He would tell you the chains were open and the room was empty, and the door that had been barred from outside every night was standing open in the morning. He would tell you he cataloged the chains. He would not tell you whether the thing they held for 11 days had died in that room or walked out of it. And when he was asked directly the last time, he said the report doesn't say, and the report is the only thing that was ever real about any of it, and the report doesn't say. The survey's final report was sealed in the spring of 1975. Its classification has outlived the state that classified it, the ministry that ordered it, and every man whose name appears on its 4 rosters. It has never been opened.
Whether the creature in the 11-day hut died in custody or walked out through a door barred from the outside is a question that exists now only in the sealed report, in a building whose name is redacted, and in the memory of an old quartermaster who catalogued a set of empty chains and would not, to the end of his life, tell anyone which it was. Real or fake, you decide. In the winter of 1942, the Red Army lost 2 men in the Western Caucasus, and then, 4 months later, got them back. But the getting them back is the part no one could explain, and the part that everyone who read the file agreed should never have happened the way the file said it did. The 2 men were privates in a rifle unit that was falling back through the high forest ahead of the German advance into the Caucasus. In the bad winter, when the front came south and everything that could go wrong in a retreat went wrong in that one. However, they did not expect their saving grace to come in the form of unknown giant beings coming from out of the deeper parts of the forest.
Their names were Semyon Volk, 22 years old, from a village outside Voronezh, and Yosef Rem, 24, from Rostov. They were separated from the column at night during a movement through timber above a river, in weather that the unit's own record calls impassable, and when the column reformed on the far side, the 2 men were not with it. There was no time to look for them. There was never time that winter to look for anyone. They were entered in the unit's record as lost, which in the retreat of 1942 meant dead, and the record moved on because the record had a great many other men to lose. They should have been dead. Everyone who has ever looked at this file starts from that because the arithmetic is not complicated. 2 men on foot, separated at night in deep timber in a Caucasus winter. No shelter beyond what they carried, no rations beyond a day's, no way to rejoin a front that was moving away from them faster than 2 men on foot could follow. Men died that winter with more than Volk and Rem had, and died within a week. The mountains alone would have been enough. The cold alone would have been enough. And that is before you add the Germans who were in those same hills and who did not take many prisoners in that campaign either. 4 months later, in the thaw, Volk and Rem walked into a Soviet rear position near the far end of the range, more than 100 kilometers from where they had been lost, frostbitten at the fingers and the ears, but not starved, not skeletal, not the walking dead that men who survive 4 months in winter mountains are when they survive at all. They walked in on their own feet. They asked for their unit by name, and they were arrested because in the Red Army in 1942, 2 men who had been recorded as lost and who reappeared 4 months later 100 kilometers away healthy were not a miracle. They were a problem. They were deserters, or they were prisoners who had been turned and sent back, or they were something else that needed explaining, and the organ that did the explaining took them into a room and asked them where they had been. And Volk and Rem told them, the debrief exists. It is the center of this whole account, and it has survived. And it is the reason any of this is more than a unit record's blank line, because the men who took Volk and Rem into that room wrote down what the 2 privates said, and they wrote it down in full, the way you write down a thing you intend to hang a man with. It runs to several pages. It is in the flat, procedural language of the organ that produced it. And that flatness is the most useful thing about it, because a document that is trying to make you feel something is a document you can argue with. And this document is not trying to make you feel anything. It is trying to establish where 2 soldiers were for 4 months. It reports what they said with no color and no wonder, and exactly that is what makes it hard to put down. The 2 men were interviewed separately, which was standard because the point of interviewing them separately was to catch them in the differences between their stories. There are no differences that matter. That is the first thing the interrogators noted, and it is noted in the file as a suspicious fact rather than a corroborating one, because 2 deserters who have rehearsed an alibi also tell the same story. And the organ was trained to see agreement as evidence of rehearsal. But the story the 2 men agreed on was not an alibi any sane deserter would invent, because it was not a story that would save them. It was a story that in 1942 was far more likely to get them shot than the desertion they were suspected of. And they told it anyway, both of them separately the same. They said that on the first night, lost in the timber and moving in what they hoped was the direction of the column, they became aware that they were not alone, not Germans, not other soldiers. Something in the trees on the slope above them, keeping their pace, moving when they moved and stopping when they stopped, staying always just inside the tree line where the dark was solid. Volk, in his account, said he thought at first it was a bear, and then said it was not a bear. And when the interrogator pressed him on how he knew it was not a bear, the file records that Volk said, a bear does not walk on 2 legs the whole night and does not stop when you stop to listen for it. Rem's account says the same. They walked all that first night with the thing above them in the trees, and neither of them slept. And in the morning it was still there, farther off, watching, and it had not closed the distance, and it had not gone away. They expected to die that first day, and they did not, and the not dying is the shape of the whole 4 months. They did not die, and they could not say why they did not die, except that the things in the trees, which by the second day they understood to be more than one, did not let them. The debrief records it as a sequence of provisions, and the word provisions is the interrogators, and it is a cold and exact word, and it is the right one. On the second day there was a carcass, a mountain animal freshly killed in a way neither man could account for, left in the open on the path they were walking, in a place they would not have chosen and could not have missed. Volk said they did not want to touch it. Rem said they were too hungry not to. They took it and they ate, and nothing came for them while they ate, though they could feel, both of them said, that they were watched the whole time. The debrief dates the beads because the interrogators wanted dates, wanted to catch the 2 men in a timeline that did not hold, and the dates held, which unsettled the interrogators more than gaps would have. On what the file numbers as the 9th day, there was the second carcass in worse country than the first, on a ledge the 2 men had climbed to only because they were being funneled up a draw with no other way out, and the carcass was waiting on the ledge when they reached it. And Rem said in his account that this was the day he stopped believing it was luck, because luck does not climb ahead of you and leave food where you have not yet decided to go. On the 14th day there was no food, and there was instead a shelter, an overhang packed on its open side with cut brush, cut, not broken, the ends of the branches showing where something had worked them, and the two men slept in it out of a wind that Volk said would have finished them in the open, and in the morning the brush had been pulled away and scattered as though to hide that the place had ever been used. On the 20th day, one of them nearly died, and it is the only time the things intervened close enough to be felt. Rem went through snow over a covered gap between rocks, the way Zalov would go through ice 30 years later in a different range, and he went into the chest and could not get purchase, and Volk could not reach him. And Rem said that what pulled him out was not Volk. He said something took him by the back of the coat, one grip from above and behind where no man was standing, and lifted him clear of the gap and set him down on solid snow and was gone before he could turn, and that the print behind him where it had braced was a single handprint pressed deep with a thumb set wrong, and that he did not tell Volk what had lifted him, and Volk did not ask, and they walked the rest of that day without speaking. It is the only time in 4 months either man was touched. Rem said the grip was careful. He said that was the worst of it, that a thing that size had taken him by the coat in a way that did not bruise him, and had thought about it and had been gentle, and he had spent 50 years not knowing what wanted him unbruised. And after that, there was always, when they were at the edge of dying, a reason not to die. A carcass, once a fire already burning in a sheltered place when they came to it, in weather where they could not have lit one, and both men swore in separate rooms that neither of them built it, and that it was burning when they arrived, and that they slept beside it, the only real sleep of the whole 4 months, and that in the morning it had burned down to coals, and there were tracks around it in the snow that were not theirs. Twice away through country they could not have crossed alone, a route down a slope or across a river gorge that appeared to them, both said, as though it had been chosen for them, as though they were being walked. The river gorge was the 31st day, and it is the bead the interrogators pushed on hardest, because it was the one that could be checked against terrain, and it checked. The two men came to a gorge that the map the interrogators later laid over their route said was not crossable on foot in winter anywhere along the stretch the men described. And they crossed it, and when they were asked how, they said there had been a way, a place where the ice had bridged the water and held, and that they had not found the place had been shown to them, that the things had gone ahead in the dark and stood on the far rim in a line, spaced along it, not moving, until the two men understood they were meant to walk toward the line, and that the line marked the only span of ice that bore weight, and that they crossed on it with the water sounding under them, and the things watching from the far side and stepping back into the trees the moment both men were across. The interrogators noted that the ice bridge, if it had existed, would have melted out by the thaw and could not be confirmed. They noted also that the men's account of the gorge's depth and orientation was correct in every particular. For a gorge, the men insisted they had crossed only once in the dark and never seen by daylight. There were quieter days, and the debrief records those too, because the interrogators wanted the whole timeline. And the quieter days are in some ways the ones that stay with a reader, because nothing happens on them, and the nothing is the point. Days when there was no carcass and no shelter and no crisis, when the two men simply walked, cold and hungry but not dying, and the things kept pace in the trees and did not provide and did not need to. And folk said you could go a week like that, and the not providing was its own kind of message, that the things knew to the hour when a man was close enough to death to need feeding and not before, that they were not generous, they were exact. He said a generous thing would have fed them every day. These fed them on the day they would otherwise have died, and not one day sooner, all winter, without error. and a thing that can measure that precisely how close a man is to dying is a thing that has watched a great many men die to learn it. The count is the thing the debrief circles and cannot settle, and it is the thing that frightened the interrogators once they let themselves think about it, though they filed the fright as a discrepancy in the men's testimony rather than name it. Early in the 4 months, the two soldiers had the sense of one thing in the trees, then of two, and by the deep of the winter they could not have said how many, 3 or 4 or more, and the number seemed to them to change, not to grow steadily as though they were meeting a group one by one, but to shift, to be fewer some weeks and more others, as though the things came and went, as though the two men were being handed off, passed along a chain of keepers through country that belonged to different ones of them in turn. Rem said that was his strongest impression by the end, stronger than fear, that he and Volk had been carried across a great many territories, and that at each border something had let go of them, and something else had taken them up, and that the daylight sighting near the end, when several of them stood in the open at once, was the only time the keepers had gathered, and that he thought, though he could not prove and would not insist, that they had gathered to hand the two men over the last border, out of the trees, and down to the road and back to their own kind, and that the gathering had been a thing arranged, a delivery, an end of a duty that had been passed hand to hand across a winter and 100 kilometers, and was now in the open snow complete. What the interrogators made of that was that no consistent number of pursuers could be established, and that the testimony was therefore unreliable. What Volk and Rem made of it, they did not fully say in 1942, and what Rem made of it 50 years later was the correction, the one thing they had left out, which was not about the number at all, or was about the number only in the way that everything in the account turned out to be about the number, because the number the two living men could never settle was a number that had, the whole time, included one more than the two of them knew. The interrogator asked, and the file records the question, whether the two men were claiming they had been rescued by an enemy. It is a reasonable question from the organ's point of view. A thing that feeds you and shelters you and walks you through the mountains is a thing with a purpose. And in 1942, a purpose was a threat, and Volk and Rem separately said no. They said the things in the trees were not the enemy and were not friends either. They did not do the things a rescuer does. They never came close. In 4 months, the file records, neither man was ever touched by one, or spoken to, or approached within what Rem estimated as 30 meters and Volk estimated as less. The things kept the two men alive and kept their distance both at once for 4 months and did not explain themselves and could not be thanked and could not be understood, and that, both men said, was the worst of it. Not the fear that they would be harmed, the fear that they never learned what they were to the things that would not let them die. They saw them clearly only once. The debrief dates it to late in the 4 months, in the last stretch before the two men came down out of the high country toward the rear position where they were arrested. There was an open place, snow-covered at the edge of the timber, and Volk and Rem came into it at the middle of the day. And the things came into it with them, all of them at once, out of the trees on both sides, and stood in the open in the daylight where the two men could see them plainly for the first and only time. It lasted, Rem thought, several minutes, though he distrusted his own sense of the time and said so, because a man being looked at by 5 of those does not count seconds well. They did not advance. They did not spread to surround, which the two soldiers, being soldiers, noticed and could not stop noticing, that a pack meaning harm would have moved to the flanks, and these did not. They simply stood in a loose line at the tree line with the snow coming down between them and the men, close enough that Volk said he could see the individual hairs at the shoulders shift when one of them breathed, close enough that the smell reached the men, which Rem described and the interrogators recorded, and which will not be repeated here except to say it was not the smell of an animal and not the smell of a man, and was the detail Rem said he could bring back most easily of all of them, 50 years on, the smell before the faces. The faces in daylight were worse than the faces at night would have been because daylight left nothing to fill in. Volk said at night a man's fear draws the face for him, and in daylight the face draws itself, and it was a face that a man's mind refused. Not because it was monstrous, but because it was nearly right. A wide, flat, human face under a heavy shelf of brow, a broad nose, a mouth that was a man's mouth, weathered gray-brown skin over human bones, arranged a hand's width too large and too heavy, and eyes that Rem said he had spent his life trying not to remember and had never once succeeded. Eyes that were not an animal's eyes, that held the two men and considered them, that had a person behind them, and that was the thing both said in separate rooms, 50 years apart. The same word from both, a person. There was a person behind the eyes, and the person was not human, and was looking at them and had kept them alive all winter for a reason the person knew and they did not. And then the largest of them, the one at the end of the line, did the thing with the body that neither man would speak of for the rest of their lives, and the sighting ended. And the two men walked down out of the mountains alone. The debrief records the description, and it records it in the men's own words as closely as the organ ever recorded anything. Both men said there were several. Volk said 5, and Rem said he did not count and thought it was more. They stood upright, taller than a large man, taller than either private had thought a living thing could be, and still be shaped like a man, covered head to foot in dark hair that went from a deep rust color at the shoulders to near black at the legs. The faces were the part both men returned to in separate rooms, and the part the interrogator pressed hardest on, because the faces were not the faces of apes. That is in the file, in the men's words, not apes. The brow was heavy and shelved, and the nose was broad, and the whole face was wide and flat and set forward, more like the face of a very old and very hard man than like anything in a zoo. And the eyes, both privates said, looked at them the way a man looks at another man, with something behind them, with a mind behind them. And that was the thing that neither Volk nor Rem could get past, and neither could describe to the interrogator's satisfaction. That they had stood in the snow for a length of time neither could estimate and been looked at, plainly in daylight by several enormous hair-covered creatures with the faces of men and the eyes of men, and that nothing had happened, and that the creatures had then gone back into the trees on both sides, and the two men had walked on and come down out of the mountains and been arrested. The organ did not believe them. Of course, the organ did not believe them. The debrief closes with an assessment, and the assessment is that the two privates were concealing the truth of a 4-month absence behind a fabrication so extravagant it could only be deliberate. And the recommendation that followed from that assessment was the recommendation the organ made about deserters in 1942. And everyone who reads the file waits for the next page to be the record of the sentence being carried out. And it is not. That is the thing. That is the second impossible fact, and it is larger than the first. Two men told a story that should have gotten them shot. In a place and a year, where the story alone, the desertion, the story was assumed to be covering, was more than enough to get them shot, and they were not shot. The recommendation was made, and the recommendation was not carried out. Volk and Rem were not executed and were not sent to a penal battalion, which was the other thing that happened to men like them. And the file does not say what happened instead. There is a gap. The debrief ends, the recommendation is entered, and the next document that concerns either man is a routine one, dated weeks later, that treats both privates as serving soldiers in good standing being posted onward, as though the debrief and its recommendation had been not overruled, which would have left a record but simply set aside, which left none. Someone made that decision. Someone read the debrief, read the recommendation to shoot 2 deserters, and decided instead to return them quietly to duty and to leave no record of the deciding. And that is the open question of the whole account. And it is a better and colder question than the creatures in the snow, because the creatures, at least the men, could describe. The decision no one can describe. No one signed it. No one explained it. 2 men who told the least believable story it was possible to tell in the worst possible year to tell it, walked out of that room alive and went back to the war. And the reason they were spared is not in the file and was not in the file when it was sealed, and is not anywhere. And the men who might have known are all long dead. The rest would be silence, and for a long time it was. Volk and Rem went back to the war. Both survived it, which is its own small unlikelihood on top of the large ones. They were demobilized, they went home, Volk to the Voronezh country and Rem to Rostov. And they did not, as far as anyone knows, ever speak of the 4 months again, not to each other and not to anyone, for the rest of their lives. There is one small record of Volk from the years after, and it is not much, and it is the only crack in his silence anyone has found. A nephew, interviewed by the same surveyor who found Rem, remembered that Volk would not go into forest. Not the deep mountains, which a man might avoid for ordinary reasons, but any forest, any stand of timber thick enough to hold a tree line. That Volk kept to open ground his whole life and made excuses that fooled no one in the family, and that the one time the nephew, as a boy, pressed him on it, Volk had said only that he did not like to be walked. 3 words, and had never explained them, and the family had taken it for an old soldier's oddity and let it alone. The surveyor understood the 3 words the moment Rem later told him the rest. But Volk was decades dead by then, and the 3 words are all of Volk's own account that survives. And they were spoken to a child who did not know what they meant. Rem kept a different kind of silence, and the surveyor learned its shape only by sitting with him. Rem had not avoided forests. Rem had gone into them deliberately, alone, an old man taking long walks into timber that worried his family. And when the surveyor asked him why, Rem said he went to see whether he would be walked again, whether the things or things like them were still there and still kept their exact arithmetic. And that in 50 years of going into the trees, he had never once been fed, and never once been touched, and never once been shown away, and that he did not know whether that was because they were gone, or because he had not yet been close enough to death to be worth their attention, and that he supposed he would find out which, eventually, on one of the walks, and that he was not afraid of it. He said he was only tired of not knowing, the way he had been tired of not knowing for 50 years. The file was sealed. It went where such files went. And it would have stayed a blank line in a rifle unit's winter record, 2 names entered as lost and never formally unentered, except that decades later a surveyor working through a regional archive for entirely unrelated reasons found the debrief and read it and could not leave it alone. The surveyor is the reason there is a second document, and the second document is the reason this account does not end where the debrief ends, because Rem was still alive. Volk had died years before, quietly, an old man in his village who had told his family nothing. But Rem was alive, very old, in Rostov, and the surveyor found him and went to him and asked him about the winter of 1942 and the 4 months and the things in the trees. And Rem, who had said nothing for 50 years, talked. Not for long. He was old and he was tired, and he did not have the debrief stamina. But he confirmed it, all of it, flatly. the way an old man confirms a thing he has stopped being afraid of. And the surveyor recorded what he said, and it matches the 1942 debrief in every particular a man could be expected to keep for 50 years. In every particular but one. Rem corrected the record on a single point, and the correction is the last thing in the account and the coldest. And it is not a correction that makes the story warmer or safer or more like a rescue. Rem said the debrief was accurate, except that he and Volk had not told the interrogators everything in 1942, and had agreed between themselves beforehand not to, because there was one detail they both understood would move them from the category of men telling a strange lie into the category of men who were not right in the head. And either category got you shot, but the second got you shot faster. So they left it out. They told the interrogators about the carcasses and the fire and the route through the mountains and the clear sighting in the snow, all of it. And they left out the one thing, and they carried the one thing out of that room, and neither of them ever said it. Volk to his grave and Rem for 50 years, until the surveyor sat in his kitchen in Rostov, and Rem, very old, decided it no longer mattered who knew. The thing they left out was this. Volk and Rem had not been the only men lost from the column that night in the timber. There had been a third, a man neither of them knew well, separated with them or near them in the same movement. And the third man had been with them at the start, in the first days, before the things in the trees. And the third man had died, early, in the ordinary way of the cold and the mountains, the way all three of them should have died. He had died on the fourth or fifth night, Rem was not sure after 50 years, and Volk and Rem had not been able to bury him in the frozen ground and had left him where he lay and gone on, expecting to follow him within a day. And the reason Rem told the surveyor this, the reason it was the one thing they had hidden, was what happened to the third man's body. Because on the clear day near the end, the day in the open snow when the creatures came out of the trees on both sides and stood in the daylight and let themselves be seen, Rem said that they had not been empty-handed. He said that one of them, the largest, the one at the end of the line, had been carrying something, had carried it out into the open and set it down in the snow in plain view of the two men before it stepped back, and that the thing it set down was the third man, their third man, the one who had died on the fourth or fifth night, 100 kilometers back and months before, whom they had left frozen in the timber and walked away from. It had been carried the whole way. It had been kept. And it was set down in the snow in front of them, whole, not eaten, not despoiled, kept through the winter the way the two living men had been kept, and laid out in the open where they would see it and understand that they had seen it, and then the creatures had gone back into the trees. Rem said he and Volk had understood in that moment that the things had not been keeping two men alive out of the mountains. They had been keeping three, and that they had not known until then whether the two of them were being saved or being carried, and that after that day they were never sure again, and that this was the thing they could not say in 1942. And he had not said for 50 years that they had walked down out of those mountains alive and had never been able to decide, either of them, for the rest of their lives, whether they had been rescued or whether they had simply been the two that lasted. The surveyor asked him what happened to the body. Rem said they left it. They left it in the snow where it had been set down, because they were a day from the rear positions and could not carry it and did not, after everything, want to. And they came down alone and were arrested and told the interrogators about everything except the third man, because a story about being fed by monsters was a lie you might survive. And a story about a dead comrade carried 100 kilometers and laid at your feet was not a lie at all. It was a thing that would put you in the ground, and they knew it, and they said nothing. Rem died not long after he told it. The surveyor's recording is the only record of the correction, and the 1942 debrief is the only record of the rest, and neither has ever been officially unsealed. And the third man's name is in the unit's record for that night, entered as lost, one of 3, the same as the other 2, with nothing after it to say that he was found, or that he was ever anything but a blank line in a bad winter.
The 2 men were saved in the Caucasus in the winter of 1942 by something that came out of the trees and were disbelieved and were spared anyway by a hand that left no signature and lived out long, ordinary lives without ever knowing what they had been to the things that would not let them die, or whether the word for it was rescued or the word for it was kept. Real or fake, you decide. I was Alex, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.